In the spring of 1912, a woman named Ava picked up a newspaper in England and read that her former husband was dead. He had gone down with the Titanic. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man in America, the richest passenger on the ship, the man Ava had married at 22 and divorced at 41 after 18 years of a marriage she would later describe, without particular softness, as repulsive, had stood on the deck of a sinking ocean liner in the North Atlantic and put his pregnant teenage wife into a lifeboat and lit a cigarette and waited for the water. He was 47 years old. He was worth $87 million. He left behind a 19-year-old widow, a posthumous son, and a 20-year-old boy named Vincent, who had just inherited $69 million. Vincent was Ava's son. He was also the son she had not taken. When Ava sued Jack for divorce in November of 1909 and the state of New York decreed in her favor 4 months later, she received a settlement of $10 million, an extraordinary sum, the equivalent of $345 million today. And she left. She went to England. She took her 7-year-old daughter Muriel. She left her 18-year-old son Vincent with his father, to whom he was devoted, and she sailed across the Atlantic with the money and the child and the freedom she had been maneuvering toward for more than a decade. 18 months later, the man she had left was dead on the ocean floor. The son she had left him with was now one of the wealthiest young men in the United States. The question this video is going to answer is not the one the title suggests. The question is not simply whether Ava's children were taken from her. The question is what it cost a woman to spend the prime of her life inside the most gilded cage in American social history. What it cost her to leave, and what it cost her when leaving, turned out to be only the beginning of a story that would not end until she was 89 years old, and the last of the people she had loved and outlasted was already 2 years in the ground. That is the real question. Drop your city in the comments, and if these stories, Eva and Carshel, the ones that sit underneath the official version of the Gilded Age, matter to you, subscribe. Now let us go back to Philadelphia in 1891, and to the morning a 22-year-old woman married the man her family had chosen for her and began the years that would define everything that followed. Ava Lowell Willing was born on September 15, 1868 in Newport, Rhode Island, to a Philadelphia family of sufficient social standing to move in the circles where the very rich found their wives. Her father was Edward Shippen Willing, a businessman from one of Philadelphia's oldest families. Her mother was Alice Carolyn Barton. Ava grew up in the Philadelphia social world that the Gilded Age produced, a world of old money and older names, of coming-out balls and European travel and the careful management of a daughter's social prospects as the primary project of her family's domestic life. She was beautiful. This is a fact that the historical record makes clear without ambiguity. She was considered one of the great beauties of her era, photographed by the best society photographers, painted by John Singer Sargent, described in the social columns of newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic in terms that emphasize the particular combination of cold perfection and vivid presence that the late Victorian era found irresistible in a woman of her class. Her most famous photograph, held by the Library of Congress, shows a woman who understands exactly what she is to the people looking at her and who has decided to give them the performance they came for and nothing more. She was not, by any account that survives, in love with John Jacob Astor IV. She said this herself, eventually, with the directness that characterized her later life. She had married him for his name and his money. She found him repulsive. These were the terms she used. They are unusual terms for a woman of her class and her era to apply to a former husband in any setting where the words could be recorded and repeated. The social code of the Gilded Age did not generally encourage this kind of honesty from its women, and the fact that Ava deployed it anyway is itself a fact about who Ava was and what she had decided to be by the time the marriage was safely behind her. The marriage itself is not difficult to explain in terms of the social arithmetic of the 1890s. The Willing family of Philadelphia had social position and reduced circumstances. The specific combination that made an Astor marriage not just acceptable, but necessary. The Astor family had money of a scale that made reduced circumstances irrelevant. John Jacob Astor IV, known as Jack, was the only son of William Backhouse Astor Jr. and the legendary Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the woman who had defined the entire social world of the American Gilded Age through the simple mechanism of her annual ballroom, which held 400 guests and thereby defined, through the mathematics of capacity, who was and was not in society. To be the wife of Jack Astor was to be automatically and without argument in society at its highest altitude. The question of what the marriage required in exchange for this altitude was not, in February of 1891, a question that the social arithmetic permitted Ava to ask. They married on February 17, 1891, at her parents' mansion at 510 South Broad Street in Philadelphia. The ceremony was large and the gifts were extraordinary, a furnished townhouse on Fifth Avenue in New York among them. The Astor social machinery absorbed Ava into its operations. She became Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV. She moved into the townhouse at 840 Fifth Avenue, into the country estate at Ferncliff in Rhinebeck, into the summer mansion called Beechwood in Newport. She became, overnight, one of the most socially positioned women in the United States. She also became, in the specific and practical sense that the Astor household required, a component in a machine she had not designed and did not control. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Mrs. Astor, as she was known to the entire social world that acknowledged her authority, was still alive and still operating at full force when Ava joined the family. Caroline had defined American high society for 3 decades through a combination of will, resource, and the specific genius for social architecture that produces true power rather than merely its appearance. She had fought a decade-long war with her cousin William Waldorf Astor over the title of Mrs. Astor, and she had won. William eventually moved his family to England and abandoned the field. She had survived the building of the Waldorf Hotel on the lot adjacent to her own Fifth Avenue mansion, and had retreated gracefully from that location without losing an inch of social ground. She was, in the vocabulary of the era and the world she dominated, formidable. Ava was her daughter-in-law. The space available to a daughter-in-law in Caroline Astor's social universe was the space Caroline defined. The functions Ava attended, the calls she made, the entertainments she gave, the causes she supported, the manner in which she presented herself in every public setting. All of these operated within a framework that Caroline had built across decades, and that did not require or invite modification from the woman who had married into it. Ava was beautiful and accomplished and charming in the specific way that Gilded Age women were trained to be charming, and she deployed all of these qualities in the service of a social position she had inherited rather than created. The marriage produced children. Vincent was born in November of 1891 within the first year. An infant son was born and died in 1896, a loss absorbed into the family's life with the particular efficiency that wealthy families of that era applied to deaths that could not be publicly discussed in full. Muriel was born in July of 1902, 11 years after Vincent, which is itself a detail that says something about the texture of the marriage in the years between. By the middle of the 1890s, Ava had established herself as a presence in London's social life. She rented houses during extended stays abroad. She moved in circles that included King Edward VII, who was then the Prince of Wales, and whose social court at Marlborough House provided an alternative to the Astor social world and an alternative to the Astor marriage. She was away from New York for months at a time. She returned, then left again. The marriage, which had never been a love match in any meaningful sense, was operating, by the turn of the century, at the level of a formal arrangement between two people who had decided that was preferable to the alternative. Jack's alternative eventually was a teenage socialite named Madeline Force, but that came later. What was happening inside Ava's marriage in the years before the divorce is not fully recoverable from the public record. The Astor family did not produce the kind of private correspondence or diary material that allows historians to reconstruct the inner texture of a Gilded Age marriage with the granularity that the human story requires. What the public record does hold is the outline. She was away from New York for extended periods by choice, with the tacit acknowledgement of everyone involved that the absences were not vacations. She was known to have had a relationship with Winthrop Rutherford, described by the people who knew him as breathtakingly good-looking, who was also involved at various points with other women of her social circle in the overlapping romantic geography of the Gilded Age upper class. Jack was unfaithful. This is stated in various accounts of the marriage without particular elaboration. It was in the context of a marriage among the very rich in the 1890s, unremarkable enough that the accounts treat it as a given, rather than as a revelation. The specific harm that the marriage did to Ava is not documented in the clinical terms that a later century would apply. What is documented is the result. The departure came as soon as it could. As soon as the death of her mother-in-law Caroline in 1908 removed the last major social sanction that had been operating against a divorce from Jack Astor, as soon as the calculus of what she would lose by leaving came out in favor of leaving, she filed in November of 1909. She was done with the marriage before the papers were filed, but the filing was the moment she could afford to be done. The grounds were desertion. This is a legal category that covers a multitude of marital realities, and in 1909 it was among the most commonly cited grounds in divorce cases where the parties had agreed or had been maneuvered into agreeing not to air the more specific and more damaging reasons for the dissolution. Desertion in the Astor divorce was a legal convenience. The marriage had not been abandoned by Jack in any simple sense. It had been abandoned by both of them sequentially and in different directions over a period of years. The legal filing captured none of this. It captured only the formal designation that allowed the state of New York to decree in Ava's favor on March 5, 1910. The settlement was $10 million. She left with the money and with Muriel, who was 7 years old. She left Vincent, who was 18. This last fact is the one the title points toward and the one the script has been building toward. Vincent stayed with his father. He was devoted to Jack. He was nearly at university age. He would go to Harvard. He would not need his mother in the daily sense that a 7-year-old girl needed her mother. And Ava's departure for England was more consistent with his life than with Muriel's. These are the practical explanations for the custody arrangement, and they are all accurate as far as they go. What they do not account for is what happened 18 months later. Jack Astor died on April 15, 1912, at 2:20 in the morning in the North Atlantic Ocean, approximately 400 miles south of Newfoundland. He had been returning from his honeymoon with Madeline Force, 18 years old when he married her, 19 when the ship went down, and he had placed her in Lifeboat 4 with the words, "We will soon see each other again," and a pair of gloves tossed after her, and a cigarette to smoke while he waited for whatever came next. His body was recovered by the cable ship Mackay Bennett a week later, identified by the initials JJA embroidered on his collar. He left an estate of $87 million. Vincent received $69 million. Muriel received a $10 million trust fund. Madeline, the 19-year-old widow, who was 5 months pregnant when the ship went down and who gave birth to a son named John Jacob Astor VI in August of 1912, received the income from a $5 million trust and the use of the Fifth Avenue mansion and the Newport mansion, as long as she did not remarry. Ava received nothing. She had received her settlement in the divorce, and the will did not provide for her further. She had no legal claim on the estate of a man she had divorced 2 years earlier. What she had was the $10 million she had taken with her to England, and the 7-year-old daughter who was now the beneficiary of her own $10 million trust, and the daughter of the man whose death on a famous ship had made his name permanent in the public memory. What she had also was Vincent, not in the legal sense, not in the financial sense, but in the sense that Vincent was now one of the most prominent young men in the United States, the principal heir of the Astor fortune, the son of the man who had become, through the particular alchemy of the Titanic disaster, a figure of genuine historical significance, the richest passenger, the man who had stood back from the lifeboat and waited, the man whose death in those specific circumstances carried the weight of a story about wealth and sacrifice and the particular dignity that the Gilded Age had always claimed for its men when they finally had to demonstrate whether they meant it. Ava returned to the United States after the disaster. She came back to be present, to be visible, to be the mother of the heir. She had left Vincent to his father and his Harvard education and his life in the orbit of the Astor fortune. And now the Astor fortune was Vincent's, and the father was gone, and Ava was back. She did not attend Jack's funeral. That absence is documented. Whatever her reasons, and there are several plausible ones, none of them required to be cruel to be understandable, she was not present for the burial of the man she had been married to for nearly 2 decades and had divorced 2 years before his death. The absence was noted. It was the kind of absence that people of the era noted and remembered and filed under the category of things that confirmed what they had always privately thought about Ava Willing. What they had always privately thought about Ava Willing is worth examining, because it shaped everything that happened to her in the years after the Titanic, and it shaped the way her story has been told in the century since. Ava was not, in the social vocabulary of the Gilded Age, a sympathetic figure. She was beautiful and unyielding. She was honest about her marriage in ways that the social code found inappropriate. She had affairs, she moved to England and preferred it to New York. She had divorced the most prominent man in American society, when divorce was still scandalous, and had then watched him die on the most famous ship in history, and had not gone to his funeral. She had taken the money and left, and come back when the money had multiplied itself 1,000-fold in the form of Vincent's inheritance. The social verdict on Ava Willing was not kind. It was not entirely wrong in the sense that the facts it was based on were accurate. But it was not entirely right either in the sense that facts and verdicts are different things, and the verdict on Ava collapsed a complicated woman into a simplified character and left the complicated woman somewhere in the gap between what the character required and what the woman actually was. The complicated woman was this: she had married a man she did not love because her family's circumstances and the calculus of her era required it. She had spent nearly 2 decades in a marriage she found repulsive, producing 2 children, managing a household of extraordinary complexity, performing the social functions that the Astor name required of its women with sufficient skill that she was considered one of the great Astor wives of her generation, even as the marriage itself was failing. She had left when she could with what she could get, in the only direction that offered something genuinely her own, rather than a continuation of the arrangement she was escaping. None of this made her a saint. She was not particularly warm. The people who knew her in later life described someone who was vivid and social and capable of genuine charm, and who was also, underneath all of it, a person who had learned from her first marriage to hold certain things back. To present the performance rather than the person, because the person had been required to perform for so long that the distance between the two was not always recoverable. She arrived in England having performed the role of Mrs. Astor for nearly 2 decades and carrying the $10 million settlement and a 7-year-old daughter and whatever she was when she was not performing. England received her. The English social world that Ava entered in 1911 was the social world she had been visiting and cultivating since the middle of the 1890s. She was not a stranger to it. She had the country estate at Regent Lodge in Regent's Park and the townhouse at 18 Grosvenor Square in Mayfair, both of which had been secured as part of the divorce settlement, and both of which positioned her in the geography of London society at exactly the altitude she required. From 1919 she was Lady Ribblesdale, having married Thomas Lister, the 4th Baron Ribblesdale, a widower in his 60s, a former master of the Buckhounds, a man whose first wife had been the daughter of Sir Charles Tennant, and whose social position was entirely genuine and entirely English, and entirely the kind of thing that a woman in her specific circumstances might find precisely what she needed. The marriage to Ribblesdale was not a love match in any more obvious sense than the marriage to Jack had been. It was a social transaction, more benign in its terms than the Philadelphia transaction of 1891, but a transaction nonetheless. Ava got the title and the social validation of a genuine English peerage. Ribblesdale got whatever financial ease the Astor settlement provided, and the company of a woman who was still, at 51, one of the more striking presences in the London social world. His family disliked her. This is stated in multiple sources without particular equivocation. His children and his extended family were civil to her face, and positive that they disliked her behind closed doors. She was not the woman his first wife had been. His first wife had been warm and social and beloved in the way that certain women are beloved who make the people around them feel seen and valued. Ava was not that kind of woman. She was vivid, and she was beautiful, and she was intelligent, and she could be excellent company in the specific mode of a person who has decided to be excellent company. And she was also fundamentally not a person whose primary interest was in making the people around her feel seen and valued. She visited Gisborne Park, the Ribblesdale family's ancestral seat in Yorkshire, exactly once. This detail, which surfaces in multiple accounts of the marriage, captures something essential about the specific nature of Ava's second marriage and about Ava herself. A woman who has spent her adult life operating at the apex of social life in 2 countries and who visits her husband's family home precisely once in the 6 years of their marriage has decided at some point that there are things she will do and things she will not do, and visiting Gisborne Park in Yorkshire was in the second category. Ribblesdale died on October 21st, 1925. He was 76 years old. Ava was 57. She had been Lady Ribblesdale for 6 years. She would outlive him by 33 years. The 33 years between the death of her second husband and her own death in 1958 are the years that most accounts of Ava Astor's life treat as epilogue. The period after the interesting part, the years during which the woman who had been Mrs. Astor and Lady Ribblesdale became, progressively, simply Mrs. Ava Ribblesdale, living in London and eventually in New York, and aging out of the social world she had occupied for so long. These years deserve more attention than they usually receive, because they are the years in which the specific costs of Ava's choices became fully visible. Muriel, the daughter she had taken to England, the daughter she had raised and carried through the divorce and the move to England and the marriage to Ribblesdale and the whole peripatetic geography of her mother's post-Astor life, married Prince Serge Obolensky in 1924. The marriage was glamorous and unstable and eventually ended in divorce in 1932, after which Muriel married Raymond von Hofmannsthal and divorced him in 1939 and married Philip Harding in 1940, and divorced him in 1945 and married David Playdel Bouverie in 1946 and divorced him in 1952, 4 marriages. The pattern of her romantic life was not entirely unlike her mother's, which is to say it was the pattern of a woman who had learned in childhood that the arrangements made in the name of love were arrangements first, and that the maintenance of those arrangements over time was not something that could be assumed. Muriel died on July 19, 1956, 54 years old, 4 marriages, and had produced 4 children, the grandchildren who would eventually receive the bulk of Ava's estate, and she died 2 years before her mother. Ava outlived her. This is the fact that is hardest to locate in the official narrative of Ava Astor's life, because the official narrative does not dwell on the specific human cost of living to 89 when the people you were supposed to outlive are already gone. Ava had outlived her first husband by 46 years. She had outlived Ribblesdale by decades. She outlived her daughter by 2 years. Vincent outlived her. He died in 1959, a year after his mother. But she had in some essential sense already outlived the relationship with Vincent too, in the specific way that mothers outlive relationships with sons they did not take when they had the chance. The token bequest. This is the detail that the record preserves without elaboration, and it requires elaboration. When Ava died on June 9, 1958 in New York City, her will left a token bequest to her son Vincent, and the bulk of her estate to Muriel's 4 children, the grandchildren. Vincent received a token, not nothing. A token. The legal and psychological distinction between nothing and a token is the distinction between the complete severance of a relationship and its formal acknowledgement at the minimum level required by the existence of a relationship at all. Ava left Vincent a token. She had left him with his father in 1910. She had come back for him after Jack died in 1912. She had maintained across the decades a relationship with her son that was sufficient to produce a bequest, but insufficient to produce anything more than the minimum that the existence of the relationship required. This is the specific shape of what the divorce cost Ava. Not the children in the dramatic sense that the title suggests. Not a forcible removal. not a legal battle or a court order or a mother dragged from her children against her will. What it cost her was the ordinary human cost of choosing the settlement over the relationship, of leaving the son who was devoted to his father, of taking the daughter who needed a mother more urgently, of calculating the specific terms on which the escape from the marriage was achievable, and paying those terms and living with what the payment produced. The payment produced $10 million and a title and a life in England, and a daughter who died before her, and a son whose bequest was minimal, and a grandson and 3 granddaughters who received the estate. It produced 89 years. The properties Ava had lived in during the Astor years were all gone from her life by the time she died. Gone to the second Mrs. Astor, or to the estate, or to Vincent, or to the various transactions through which the physical evidence of the Astor marriage had been distributed among its survivors according to the terms of the will of the man who had died on the Titanic. Ferncliff, the 2,000-acre Astor estate in Rhinebeck, passed to Vincent. He renovated it extensively. He eventually demolished the original mansion and built a new structure on the property. The grounds he donated ultimately to various purposes, including a public park. Ferncliff Mausoleum, the burial facility that Vincent later established on part of the original estate grounds, became the resting place of figures ranging from Jim Henson to Judy Garland, a fact that sits oddly against the estate's origins as the country seat of the richest family in American social history. Beechwood, the Newport mansion where Jack and Madeline had been married in Caroline Astor's ballroom, passed through various hands after the Titanic. Madeline had use of it as long as she did not remarry. She remarried in 1916. The house went back to the Astor estate and eventually to Vincent, who sold it. It changed hands multiple times across the 20th century and is now operated as an events venue, a use that would have been unimaginable to Caroline Astor, who had used the ballroom to define who was and was not worth knowing in American society. And that would have been to Ava simply the logical destination for a house that had always been a stage set rather than a home. The townhouse at 840 Fifth Avenue, the house that Jack had built and that Ava had lived in as Mrs. Astor, was left to Madeline under the terms of Jack's will as long as she did not remarry. Madeline remarried. The house went to Vincent. It was eventually demolished. The building that replaced it is no longer there either. The address is, like most of the physical record of the Astor social world, gone. Absorbed into the ongoing metabolism of Manhattan's built environment, which has never shown particular reverence for the houses of the Gilded Age. Ava's own houses, Regent Lodge and Regent's Park, the Grosvenor Square townhouse, the various London establishments she had occupied during the baroness years, are in other hands, or gone or converted to uses that have no memory of the woman who furnished them and entertained in them and managed the social life of an English baroness with the same professional competence she had brought to the management of the social life of an American heiress. She ended at 720 Park Avenue in New York, an apartment, not the Fifth Avenue townhouse that had come with the marriage, not the Newport mansion or the Rhinebeck estate. An apartment on Park Avenue furnished to her taste where she entertained quietly and was remembered for charitable work conducted without publicity, and where she died on June 9, 1958, and was buried at Locust Valley Cemetery in Nassau County, Long Island. Not in the Astor family plot, not in the English churchyard near Gisborne Park, Locust Valley, Long Island. Her own grave, under her own name, or rather under the name she had taken from her second husband and kept, because it was the name she had been when she had been most herself, or at least most free, which is the closest thing to the same condition that a woman of her era and her particular circumstances could usually manage. There is a painting of Ava Astor by John Singer Sargent. Sargent was the great portraitist of the Gilded Age, the man who painted Astor wives and Vanderbilt daughters and the women of European aristocracy with the specific quality of attention that made his portraits feel like they were seeing their subjects rather than simply recording them. He painted Ava during the years of her marriage, and the portrait captures something that the famous Library of Congress photograph also captures, but in a different register. The combination of extraordinary physical presence and a quality of reserve that the era read as coldness, and that later observers have sometimes read differently. The reserve in Sargent's portrait is the reserve of a woman who has learned, through the specific education of an Astor marriage, that the distance between the public self and the private self is a distance worth maintaining. By the time Sargent painted her, she had been performing the role of Mrs. John Jacob Astor for years. Years more of it still to come. The performance was excellent. The woman behind it was, in the specific sense that the performance was designed to prevent, not entirely available to the painter or to anyone else who looked. This is the particular tragedy of Ava Astor's story. Not the custody arrangement, not the divorce, not the deaths she outlived. The particular tragedy is the quality of reserve that the Sargent portrait captures, and that every account of the woman confirms. She was formed by the specific pressures of a Gilded Age marriage she had not chosen and a social world she had been inducted into rather than having entered. Into a person who had become professionally excellent at the presentation of a self that was not entirely her own. She had married Jack at 22 and learned to be Mrs. Astor, divorced at 41 and taken $10 million and reinvented herself as a peer's wife. She had outlived the Baron and spent more than 3 decades learning to be Mrs. Ava Ribblesdale, which is to say, learning to be, for the first time in her adult life, simply Ava, an Ava who had no one to perform for except herself, and whoever came to the quiet dinners at the St. Regis and the Park Avenue apartment. Whether she found, in those final decades, something that felt like the self she had been before the performing began, whether there was a self before the performing began that was recoverable at 75 or 80 or 89, is not a question history can answer. What remains is the outline, the dinners, the charitable work, the quiet years, the grave at Locust Valley. She lived to be 89 years old. She outlived her first husband by 46 years. She outlived Ribblesdale. She outlived her daughter by 2 years. She watched the Astor fortune that had defined her social existence disperse through Vincent's hands. Vincent, who had no children and who would die a year after his mother. Into the various charities and institutions and purposes that Vincent Astor spent his life giving his money away to. She was the woman the social world had decided it understood. The woman who had married for a name and a fortune, and had said so. The woman who had found her husband repulsive, and had said that too. The woman who had left her son and taken her daughter and gone to England and become a baroness and outlived everyone who had given her a role to play. She was also, underneath all of that, a woman who had been 22 years old when the era had calculated her value and had determined its price, and had arranged the transaction that would consume the next 2 decades of her life. She paid, she left, she lived. The Titanic connection is what most people know about Ava Astor, if they know anything about her at all. She appears in the Titanic story as a parenthetical, the divorced first wife, the woman Jack had left or been left by, the shadow that the social scandal of the divorce cast over the more romantic and more tragic story of Jack and young Madeline on the doomed ship. The Titanic story needed a villain for the first marriage, and the historical record cast Ava in that role with the efficiency of a narrative that knows what it needs. She had said she found him repulsive. She had not gone to his funeral. Coming back for the son and the inheritance, those were the facts the social world assembled. These facts, arranged in the order that the Titanic story requires, produce a character. The mercenary first wife, the social climber who had used the Astor name and taken the money and left, the woman who had traded her family for a settlement and then returned to profit from the tragedy of the man she had abandoned. The character is not entirely false. The facts are accurate. The ordering of them is the problem, because that ordering serves the story of Jack and Madeline, the ill-fated lovers, the age difference and the scandal, and the honeymoon, and the sinking. And Ava's role in that story is the role that makes Jack sympathetic. If Ava found him repulsive, if the first marriage was mercenary, then the second marriage becomes comprehensible. The aging man seeking warmth after years of indifference. The character of Ava as villain makes Jack a figure of pathos rather than simply a Gilded Age millionaire who divorced his first wife and married a teenager. This is not the only way to tell the story. There is another arrangement of the same facts. A woman spent 20 years of her life in a marriage she had not chosen, in a household managed by her mother-in-law's authority, in a social world that had no mechanism for acknowledging what she might have been if she had not been required to be Mrs. Astor. When the door opened, she walked through it. She said what she thought about the marriage, because honesty, at that point, was the only thing that was entirely her own. She was called cold for it. She is called cold still. The child she did not take grew up to inherit $69 million. The child she did take married 4 times and died at 54. The man she divorced died on the Titanic and became immortal. The woman who outlived all of them died at 89 in a Park Avenue apartment and was buried at Locust Valley and left Vincent the minimum the relationship required. This is not a story about a woman whose children were taken from her. It is a story about what it cost a woman to do the taking, to take the settlement, to take the freedom, to take the daughter and leave the son and go across the Atlantic to the life that was the only version of her own life she was ever going to get. It cost more than the $10 million. It cost more than the title. It cost more than the years. It cost the specific shape of what she became, the woman in the sergeant portrait, the baroness who visited Gisborne Park once, the mother who measured what she owed, the woman who outlived everyone she had made herself from, and who ended finally under her own name in a Long Island cemetery, available to no one's calculation but her own. Vincent Astor died on February 3, 1959, 8 months after his mother. He had inherited $69 million from his father at 20 years old. He had spent his adult life giving it away to the New York Zoological Society, to the New York Public Library, to various housing and social welfare projects in New York City, to the Vincent Astor Foundation that continued after his death. He had been married 3 times. He had no children. The Astor fortune that had organized the social world of the Gilded Age, that had defined who was and was not in society through the mathematics of Caroline's ballroom, that had built the Waldorf Astoria and the Fifth Avenue mansions and the Newport summers that defined American aristocracy for half a century, ended with Vincent without a direct heir. He left his estate to the Vincent Astor Foundation. The foundation continued his philanthropic work for decades before merging with other organizations. The money went where he had always been directing it, into the city that the Astors had helped build, and that had outlasted all of them. Ava's estate went to Muriel's children. The grandchildren who received it were Prince Ivan Obolensky, Princess Sylvia Obolensky, Romana von Hofmannsthal, and Emily Harding, names that locate them precisely in the world Ava had chosen. The European aristocratic world that she had chosen as her refuge from the world of her first marriage. Her money ended in that world. Her daughter's descendants carried it forward. Vincent got the minimum. The specific question this story set out to answer was whether the title was accurate, whether they took her children from her. The answer the evidence supports is this: the social world Ava Willing had been born into, and the specific transaction that social world had arranged for her at the age of 22, took 2 decades from her. It took them in the specific form of a marriage she had not chosen and could not leave until the calculus of what leaving cost had finally come out in favor of leaving. It took them in the form of a social position that required a performance she maintained for nearly 2 decades, and that shaped her into the person who could give that performance indefinitely. The children were the terms of the escape. She took the daughter. She left the son. She paid the price that made the leaving possible, and she lived with the payment for the remaining 48 years of her life. They did not take her children. She made the calculation that the century required of her, and she took what she could carry and left behind what she could not. The son received the minimum. The daughter died first. The woman who had been Mrs. Astor lived to 89 and was buried at Locust Valley under the name of her second husband, the one she had chosen rather than been assigned to, and that name is the last fact the record holds about her: Ava Lowell Willing. Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV, Lady Ribblesdale, Mrs. Ava Ribblesdale. She was born on September 15, 1868, in Newport, Rhode Island. She died on June 9, 1958, in New York City. She was 89 years old. She outlived the marriage and the husband and the title and the daughter and the Astor fortune itself. What she did not outlive was the calculation that had been made for her at 22 in a world that had looked at Ava Willing and seen a transaction. She was the transaction. She paid the transaction's price. She left what she could not carry. And what she left behind has been, in the story, the world tells about the Astors and the Titanic and the Gilded Age and the women who moved through all of it, the thing that defined her, the cold woman, the one who left, the one who said she found him repulsive and meant it. She meant it. That the evidence holds without ambiguity. Everything else, the courage of it, the cost of it, the specific human shape of a woman who spent the prime of her life performing a role she had not chosen, and who left when leaving became possible, and who lived 48 more years in the echo of what the leaving had cost. That is here, in this account, alongside the facts the official version already holds. She was Ava Astor. She was more than the transaction they made of her. The record says so now. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor ruled American high society from a ballroom. The ballroom was in her mansion at 350 Fifth Avenue, and it held, at capacity, approximately 400 people. This number was not accidental. Caroline had arrived at 400 through a process of social calculation that was, in its own terms, as precise and as consequential as any financial calculation that the men of the Astor family had ever performed. She had decided that the number of families in New York worthy of inclusion in the social world she was defining was approximately 400. The ballroom held 400. The mathematics were clean. The annual Astor Ball, held in the early weeks of January each year following a dinner in the smaller rooms of the mansion, was the mechanism by which Caroline exercised and maintained her authority. The invitations were the year's most consequential social document. To receive one was to be confirmed in your position. To fail to receive one was to be informed, without the discomfort of direct communication, that your position was in question. The mechanism was as elegant and as brutal as any exercise of institutional power, and Caroline deployed it with the specific combination of graciousness and iron will that had made her over 3 decades the unchallenged arbiter of who was and was not worth knowing in the city where the Gilded Age had located its American headquarters. Ava had married into this world. She had not created it, and she did not control it, and she was not, in the hierarchy that Caroline's social architecture produced, its primary figure. She was its daughter-in-law. In practice, this meant that she was an ornament, an extraordinarily beautiful and accomplished ornament, positioned at exactly the right altitude of the social structure, performing exactly the functions the structure required. She attended the balls, she gave the entertainments, she made the calls. She managed the household at 840 Fifth Avenue and the country house at Ferncliff and the summer mansion at Beechwood with the efficiency of a woman who had been trained from childhood for exactly this administrative function. She did it for nearly 2 decades, and she hated it. Not the houses necessarily, not the specific textures of the life, the furniture, the parties, the Newport summers, the Fifth Avenue winters. What she hated, or what the evidence of her eventual departure and her eventual honesty suggests she hated, was the specific condition of being an ornament in a machine she could not modify, and from which she could not, for a very long time, escape without paying a price that the social arithmetic had been designed to make prohibitive. The social arithmetic worked like this. A woman of Ava's position who sought a divorce in the 1890s or the early 1900s was not simply ending a marriage. She was exiting the social structure that the marriage had given her access to, and she was entering a different social category, the divorced woman, that carried specific and significant social penalties. She would lose standing. She would lose the houses, or at least the access to them. She would lose the position that the Astor name provided automatically, and that no subsequent arrangement could provide at the same altitude. She would lose the ability to move freely in the social world that Caroline's 400 defined and dominated. Ava calculated. She calculated across the years of her marriage, during the extended stays in England, during the visits to the Prince of Wales's social circle at Marlborough House, during the slow and sustained process of building an alternative social infrastructure. English friends, English houses, English relationships that would not evaporate when the American ones did. She calculated until the calculation came out in her favor. It came out in her favor when Caroline Astor died in October of 1908. Caroline Schermerhorn. Astor's final years had not been her best. She had been suffering from what her family described as mental decline, a progressive deterioration that had produced in the last years of her life the particular cruelty of a woman whose entire identity had been organized around her social mastery, finding that mastery increasingly beyond her. She had begun, in the years before her death, to behave as though the great balls of the past were still occurring, to receive guests who were not there, to dress for entertainments that were not happening, to live, in some essential sense, inside the social world she had built rather than in the present that was replacing it. She died on October 30th, 1908. She was 78 years old. For Ava, the death was a signal, not a cause for celebration. Nothing in her history suggests she was the kind of person who celebrated deaths, even deaths that were convenient for her, but a signal that the most significant sanction against her departure from the marriage had been removed. Caroline's social authority had been the roof over the structure that made the Astor marriage worth maintaining. With Caroline gone, the architecture of the argument for staying was changed. Ava filed for divorce 13 months later, in November of 1909. What came between the death of Caroline and the filing of the divorce was a period of negotiation, not the legal negotiation of the settlement terms, which came later, but the preliminary negotiation of the terms on which a woman of Ava's position and her specific circumstances could exit a marriage to a man of Jack's position without destroying what she was attempting to preserve. She was attempting to preserve the English social world. She was attempting to preserve the specific position she had built in London over more than a decade of sustained investment, the houses, the relationships, the standing in a social order that was, in certain important respects, not subject to the sanctions that the American social world imposed on divorce. England in 1909 had its own complicated relationship with divorce among the aristocracy, but it did not have Caroline Astor's 400, and the women of King Edward's social world had demonstrated through the specific evidence of their own lives that romantic and marital irregularity was not necessarily fatal to social standing if it was managed with sufficient style. Ava had style. What she also had, by the time of the filing, was enough standing in the English world to make the American sanctions less threatening than they would have been a decade earlier. The settlement negotiation produced the $10 million. It also produced the custody arrangement. Vincent was 18 and devoted to his father and about to enter Harvard, which is to say he was not a child whose needs required his mother's physical presence in the sense that a 7-year-old required it. He was a young man who had chosen his father's world, and Ava's departure was not a removal from Vincent so much as it was a formalization of a distance that had been accumulating across the years of her extended English stays. Muriel was 7. She went with Ava. This was, in the practical sense, the only arrangement that the circumstances permitted and the only arrangement that was consistent with the actual needs of the two children, as those needs existed in the winter of 1909 and the spring of 1910. This is the accounting that the official story does not give the custody arrangement. The official story casts it in these dramatic terms that the title of this video also reaches for. Children taken, mother separated from son, the mercenary transaction of a woman who put the money above the family. The accounting that the evidence actually supports is more complicated and more human than that. A woman left a marriage that had been failing for more than a decade and took the child who needed her, and left the one who was a step away from adult life and who had always belonged emotionally to the world of his father. The complication arrives 18 months later when the father is dead on the bottom of the North Atlantic, and the step toward adult life has landed Vincent in the position of one of the wealthiest young men in America. Vincent Astor's adult life was organized around the attempt to give away the money he had not asked for. He inherited $69 million at 20 years old. He spent the next 48 years of his life directing large portions of it toward New York City. The New York Public Library, the New York Zoological Society, housing projects in Harlem, the Vincent Astor Foundation that he established, and that continued his work after his death. He was married 3 times, none of which produced children. He died in February of 1959, a year after his mother leaving his estate to the Vincent Astor Foundation. His relationship with Ava after the divorce and after Jack's death was not the relationship that a mother and son might have had if the circumstances had been different. It was a relationship that functioned. They were in contact. They saw each other across the decades of his adult life. She was his mother in the formal and legal sense. But that had been shaped from its beginning by the specific circumstance of a woman who had left him with his father, and a father who had died on a famous ship, and the particular difficulty of reconstructing intimacy across a gap of years and choices in the Atlantic Ocean. That bequest was, in this light, not a punishment. It was the honest accounting of a relationship that had maintained itself at a specific level across the decades, and whose honest assessment, at the moment of Ava's death, produced a specific bequest rather than an equal one. Vincent was not disinherited. He received what the relationship, in her honest assessment, was worth. He had received from his father's estate $69 million. He did not need Ava's money. What he had needed, perhaps, in the years between his father's death and his mother's was something the money could not produce, and that the specific circumstances of the divorce had made difficult to provide. He outlived her by 8 months. He died without children. The Astor fortune, which had organized American social life for half a century, ended with him. Dispersed into the foundation, into the institutions he had supported, into the ongoing life of the city that the family had helped to build. The Newport mansion, where Jack and Madeline had married in October of 1911, is still there. Beechwood stands on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, a white Italianate structure that was built originally in 1851 and expanded by William Backhouse Astor, Jr. in 1881 into the form that Ava had known as the Astor Summer Residence. The Newport summers Ava had spent there were, in the social calendar of the Gilded Age, the annual demonstration of who had arrived at the altitude that the season required. The house is now operated as an events venue. It has been through multiple owners and multiple purposes since the Astor era. It has hosted weddings and corporate events and various of the commercial uses that the great houses of the Gilded Age have found as the fortunes that built them have dispersed and the families that occupied them have diminished or simply moved on. Ava does not appear in the house's current marketing materials. Neither does Caroline. The Titanic connection appears. Of course it does, because the Titanic connection is what draws people to any Astor property in Newport. Jack and Madeline married there. Jack died on the ship 6 months later. The story is too dramatic to omit. Ava is not the dramatic story. Ava is the woman who was already gone from Beechwood by the time the wedding happened, who had left Jack and the houses and the social architecture of the American life, and had gone to England with her $10 million and her 7-year-old daughter in her plans. England was the right call, in the sense that the life she built there after the divorce was, by any measure she would have recognized, more genuinely her own than the life she had maintained at Beechwood and on Fifth Avenue for the years of the marriage. The English social world gave her something the American one never had: the specific freedom of a woman who has moved beyond the authority of the figure who had defined the terms of her existence. Caroline was dead. Jack was in Newport, marrying a teenager. The Astor world's accounting was someone else's problem. She went to England. She became Lady Ribblesdale. She visited Gisborne Park once, and she was right about that too, or as right as a person can be about the choices that shape a life without their being able to see, at the moment of making them, how the life will land. The Sargent portrait deserves its own accounting because it is the most precise record we have of what Ava Willing looked like to the world she occupied, and possibly of what she looked like to herself. John Singer Sargent painted Ava during the years of her marriage, the years when she was Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV, and was performing that role at the highest level of competence that the role permitted. He painted her with the specific quality of attention that made his Gilded Age portraits feel like documents rather than simply images. The sense that the painter has seen something in his subject that the subject might not have known was visible. What the portrait shows is a woman of extraordinary physical presence, the combination of dark hair and pale skin and formal posture, and the specific quality of the gaze that her most famous Library of Congress photograph also captures. The gaze is level and uninviting in the specific way that a woman's gaze becomes uninviting when she has been performing for long enough that performance and self-protection have become the same gesture. The Gilded Age women who sat for Sargent were not, generally, women who were required to explain themselves to the painter. They were women who were paying for a portrait and who expected the portrait to deliver a specific social document, confirmation of their position, their beauty, their belonging to the world that required Sargent to paint them. They were right to expect this because Sargent generally delivered it. What he also delivered in the best of his Gilded Age portraits was the person inside the social document. The slight tension in the hands, the quality of attention in the eyes that is different from the attention of a person who is comfortable, the specific way that a woman who has been required to be beautiful and accomplished and positioned for long enough begins to look, in her unguarded moments, like someone who is doing something rather than simply being someone. It is one of the best Sargent portraits of the Gilded Age precisely because it captures both things simultaneously, the social document and the person inside it. One layer says, "This is Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the great beauties of her era, at the altitude of the social world she occupies." The person inside it says something that the portrait does not put into words, but that the quality of the gaze communicates to anyone who looks carefully enough. She was not happy to be there, not in the painting, not in the marriage, not in the specific position that the marriage required her to occupy. She was performing with exceptional skill a role that the world had determined was her role, and the performance was so good that most people who looked at her saw only the performance. Sargent saw something else. He painted it. The portrait is the most honest record of Ava Willing that exists. Well, she died on June 9, 1958 in New York City, 89 years old. Caroline Astor she had outlived by 50 years, Jack by 46, Ribblesdale by 33 years, her daughter Muriel by 2 years. She had outlived most of the social world she had been inducted into at 22, and that she had spent the decades of her adult life partially inhabiting, partially escaping, and partially remaking into something more genuinely her own. The last years in New York, the apartment at 720 Park Avenue, the quiet dinners, the charitable work conducted without publicity, were not the Ava Astor years. They were not even the baroness years. They were the years of a woman who had arrived, finally, at something that did not require a performance. The Park Avenue apartment was not Beechwood. It was not Grosvenor Square. It was a place she lived without the requirement of being anything other than the person she was at the end of a long life that had required her to be many things for many other people. She was buried at Locust Valley Cemetery in Nassau County, Long Island. The grave is under the name Mrs. Ava Willing Ribblesdale, the name she had chosen to retain after coming back to the United States in 1940, the name that identified her by both her birth identity and her second husband's title, the name that was hers in a more fundamental sense than Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV had ever been. She had been Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV for 18 years. She had been Lady Ribblesdale for 6. She had been Mrs. Ava Willing Ribblesdale, simply herself under a combined name, for the 18 years between the death of Ribblesdale and her own death. The duration is the same, 18 years in the Astor marriage, 18 years in her own name at the end of her life. The arithmetic is the kind of thing you notice when you look at the numbers and let them speak. The years given over to a role she had not chosen paid, eventually, for the years she lived as she chose. The payment had been enormous. The years she bought with it had been real. The calculation had been hers, finally, and she had made it with the same precision that the social world around her had always attributed to her, and that she had finally, in the years after the divorce, turned toward her own purposes, rather than toward the purposes of the machine that had made her. Cold, they said. Calculating, they said. She married for money and left when it suited her, and did not go to his funeral, and came back for the heir, and gave the heir what she determined he was owed, and lived to 89, and died under her own name. All of these things were true, and she was also a woman who had been 22 years old when the social arithmetic of the Gilded Age had calculated her value and arranged her accordingly, and who had spent the rest of her long life in one way or another working her way back to something that was actually hers. She found it, imperfectly, at a cost that history does not fully account for. But she found it. The one who left. The one who said she found him repulsive and meant every word. She meant them. And they are here now, in the full context that the simple verdict never provided. She was Ava Astor. She was more than the verdict the Titanic story made of her. Locust Valley says so. The portrait says so. 89 years say so. That is everything.